Welcome to our next discipleship class. So we had left off on Matthew 24, verse 38. This is the same screen that we left off on the last study. And just to review this verse, we have come to the place where Jesus makes a comparison to the days prior to the tribulation period with the days of Noah. So if we were to read the previous verses, we'd come up to where he says, as in the days of Noah, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be, right? For, as in the days before the flood, okay, now that's before the physical judgment on the world, they were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. So once God had preserved his people in Noah and his family, then the judgment on the world, the physical judgment, came. So we had said, as it says in A here, this pictures normal life, not the post-rapture judgment, chaos, etc., because half the world's population will be killed by the time we get to the bowls. So you're talking just a massive time of chaos and anarchy, and obviously the judgments that are coming down out of heaven, right? You get the seals, the trumpets, the bowl judgments. So this is, we've talked about you hear in the news they're unprecedented times. Well, this is actually going to be the unprecedented time. There'll be nothing like it. That's what Jesus said, and that's what we had gone previous to explain that prophets said, like Joel, Daniel, and Jeremiah. So number one says, in other words, this is business as usual. This could not be true of conditions at the end of the tribulation period, right? Seals, trumpets, and bowls, because it will be such a marked, it's a prophesied time, it's an anticipated time, it's a time of judgment, there'll be cosmic events and everything else, there'll be the miraculous, or at least appears to be the miraculous stuff that the beast is performing, the false prophet to bring worship to the beast, and all this is happening. Meanwhile, you have a global economic system that is being enacted, and people required to use it in order to survive. So this is not anything that we've seen. Now, do we see hints of this now? Sure. Do we see the preparation for it? Absolutely. There's no way that the tribulation period's going to start, and then all of a sudden they're just going to make all this stuff. I mean, all this has to be in development. Look, I worked for IBM for 12 years, back in the 80s into the 90s, and the technology for what they can do today was really being developed, much of it by IBM, very sophisticated technology company, and as we've now moved into the year 2021, the advancement in technology, even from them, is staggering. As a matter of fact, I mean, look, I spent 20 years in the high-tech industry, so I do understand something about technology, and where we're at today is light years ahead of where we were 30 to 40 years ago. So we're talking just huge jumps. Now, but they had great technology for doing a lot of stuff, even in the end of the 80s and into the 90s, when the internet was just starting to be utilized and developed, and companies were adding local networks to connect to the internet so that their employees could be on the internet for business reasons and everything else. So personally, I grew up through the development of the personal computer. And I've been able to watch it from a unique perspective because, prior to there ever being a personal computer, we had to not only build computer models, but also be able to fix them when they broke. So, we were trained on it down to the electrical components and the chip level and everything else, dealing with, gated pulses on an oscilloscope and everything. It was fun, but it was very, very technical, and that gives you a base understanding. But the problem is that what they could have done, 30 years ago, the public was not prepared for that kind of technology breaking out into normal use in society. Well, we've not only been mentally conditioned or psychologically conditioned, now the technology actually exists, and it's extremely advanced. So by the time the Antichrist or the beast, comes on the scenes and wants to develop this economic program where everybody is electronically tracked, and you have to be part of it in order to buy and sell and all that, that's not going to be difficult to do because the infrastructure is actually there now. So in number 2 here, it says, Peter used the example of Noah and the flood judgment to illustrate deliverance of the godly from coming physical judgment upon the world. And he talks about that in 2 Peter 2:5. So let's take a quick look at 2 Peter 2:5. I'll use eSword here. So if we start at verse 4, it says, For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly, and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day, seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. Now notice it says in verse 9, Then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation, that the word is trial, and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment. And especially those who walk according to the flesh in the lusts of uncleanness and despise authority. They're presumptuous, self-willed, not afraid to speak evil of dignities. Whereas angels, who are greater in power and might, do not bring a reviling accusation against them before the Lord. So that goes on and on. Now, what Peter is saying is that there's a comparison here between the judgment in Noah's day. God preserved Noah, but at the same time, when the flood came, this was a physical judgment on the world. Now, he also, like in number 3 here, it says Peter also used Lot's removal, which we just read, from Sodom before that physical judgment, as an illustration of how God will do the same for the believers in this current time. So during the church age, God will deliver his people in the rapture, and then the judgment God will reserve unto judgment, as he says in verse 9. The Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment. Now, the day of judgment is not eternal judgment. The day of judgment is the physical judgment. That's what Peter is making the comparison to. So, as we move on, right, to the next verse, Jesus says, and, in other words, speaking of this times with Noah, and did not know, right, until the flood came and took them all away. This is the people that were outside the ark. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. So there's a comparison here. The people outside the ark were taken away, and they were obviously taken away and they were judged. This was a physical judgment on the world. This was not their eternal judgment. Now, in their death, they would go to eternal damnation if they weren't saved. However, the judgment that's being compared to is a physical judgment. Now, the verb took in this verse is iro, right? If you want the phonetic of that, means to lift, carry, or take up or away. Vine's Dictionary of New Testament Words says it is a different word than taken, occurring in the next two verses. So we're in verse 39, and we need to understand that the Greek word used in verse 39 is different than 40 and 41. That's the point. So this word took means to lift, carry, take up or away. And they were lifted up in this water and carried off to judgment. That's very, very clear. That's what actually happened. This is at least curious why Matthew changed the word from one verse to the next two. In other words, if Matthew was not going to introduce the concept of the rapture, why did he not use the exact same word? It's not entirely decisive, but it's certainly curious, and it provides another dot to connect to not only the context but the subject that's being dealt with, right? So, since he didn't need to, in other words, Matthew didn't need to change these words, only if he's trying to probably say something a bit different, especially if he meant the same type of taking for the same reason. In other words, what do I mean by that? When we get into verse 40 and 41, the people that, and again, we're talking all now premillennial, pre-tribulational believers. So within that group of people, obviously I'm in that group, within that group of people, there's two views. One view is that verses 40 and 41 is talking about the rapture of the church. The other is that it's talking about taking people to judgment, because though we all have the same view on the rapture, some see the context of the entire sermon, the Olivet Discourse here, by Jesus being just talking about Israel. Now, I understand. I really don't have any problem with that perspective. I think, to be more accurate, it is talking about the rapture, which I'll get into. Okay? Now, the next two verses, 40 and 41, are viewed by pre-trib rapture believers, like I just said, as either taking in the rapture or the taking of the wicked to judgment, right, at the end of the tribulation period. There are good scholars on both sides. We call this an in-house debate. Now, I think it's just more consistent scripturally, but I'm going to provide my own reasons for arguing that it is speaking about the rapture in verses 40 and 41. All right? So this is the verses. Then two men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other left. Reasons, I believe these verses speak of believers taken in the rapture of the church and not unbelievers taken to judgment. Now, obviously, the first reason is because, well, like, why would Matthew not just use the same word to express the same thing? But the first reason is this. The shift in verse 36 with peride, meaning now concerning, which introduces a slightly new yet complementary subject. This changes the focus of the subject to discuss life before the tribulation, not a continuation of life during the tribulation. Jesus began to speak of how to know when his second coming was near from the fig tree parable. Verse 32, correlating all these things, verse 33, right, in reference to the signs that will occur during the tribulation period, which we went through, which is verses 5 to 31. He then adds the reassurance of their certainty, right, in the previous verses to this. His words are not going to pass away. So he gives that assurance. People during that time are going to need that assurance, especially Israel, because God's going to be dealing with them. But that's reason one, the periday shift. And I know people have different views on that, but I believe that it's there. Matthew put it there because he's trying to make that point. Now, if you ignore the shift, you must conclude the taking occurs at the end of the tribulation, since there is no shift to talk about life prior to Daniel's 70th week. So if you say, well, I don't really think the shift is significant, which some scholars do, then yes, you would think that it's just a continuation of a discussion of what is happening in the tribulation period. But as I showed you, last week, and in the, the timing relationship, charts, that I really think that that is not as coherent a view when you start reading the further verses. Now, both post-tribbers and pre-tribbers who do not believe the taking refers to the rapture, in other words, in verses 40 and 41, assign these verses as an event at the end of the tribulation period. Therefore, they understand the ones left are left to enter the kingdom. Now, I know one of the main reasons why people that believe in a pre-trib rapture do not want to talk about these verses as the rapture is because it's the post-tribulationists that say, well, if it's just a continuation of the chronology through the tribulation period, and then you have these people taken, well, we think it's the rapture, so that puts the rapture at the end of the tribulation period. And so, as opposed to fight that, a lot of pre-tribulational scholars have basically taken that view off the table and said, no, they're not believers, they're people taken to judgment. I just don't know that the text can fully support that, okay? I believe either of these views confuse the context by ignoring the shift and forces people to redefine imminence, right? Of the day and hour, no one knows. But I think they redefine imminence unsatisfactorily and unnaturally, especially when Jesus just got through teaching about the signs that must precede his second coming and now states that no one knows the day or the hour. He cannot be referring to the second coming since people will know of that timing. So let's back up for a second. Jesus just gets through explaining all the details. He gives you a high-level view, verses 5 to 14, of the whole tribulation period. Then he backs up to the middle in verse 15, and he says, this is the abomination of desolation. Then he gives you the last 3.5 years from verses 15 through 31 till then the angels are gathering Israel, right, from all four corners of the earth. Then he says, okay, all these things are going to happen. Let's look at the parable of the fig tree. There's going to be a timing to it, but obviously he's talking about something that you can visually observe, and there is evidence for it, because otherwise it would be meaningless to bring up the parable of the fig tree. He's saying that when the fig tree brings its fruit, you know that summer is near, and the same thing is you know that when all these things, now he has to be referring to what he just talked about, when all these things are happening, you know my coming is near. Now, obviously, if he's talking about all these things, he's talking about the second coming at the end of the tribulation. He's saying there are these signs that are going to give you the indication that I'm at the door here, right? I'm going to arrive. Now, obviously, if you go back to Daniel, from the abomination of desolation, you can measure the 3.5 years. And if you wanted to go back to Daniel and measure from the time that the Antichrist makes a covenant with those in Israel, you get 7 years from then. You add the events that he talks about in the detail, and then other areas of the Bible where it discusses the tribulation period, and it becomes pretty clear that you can anticipate his second coming in judgment to establish the millennial reign. But then he gets to the place after he talks about the fig tree, he says, but. Now, that's the shift, right? But no one knows the coming of the Son of Man. Well, how can that be? He just said that, all these things have to take place. Well, what people don't know and what he didn't know in his humanity and that the angels don't know in heaven is when the tribulation period starts. Once the tribulation period starts, that actually begins the clock for his arrival in the second coming. So, but nobody knows when that's going to occur. So we went to 1 Thessalonians 5. We talked about how people are going to be caught during that time. It's going to come on them suddenly. It's an imminent arrival. But you can't have the rapture and the beginning of the tribulation having no signs and imminently, in other words, can happen at any time, arrive, and them not be occurring, with a coinciding time frame. So, if it's like, well, the rapture is going to happen, then the 7-year tribulation sometime after that, well, then that means that the 7-year tribulation requires the rapture to happen first, and somebody can know the time. At least okay, well, rapture happened. Okay, now the tribulation's going to happen at any moment, right? But we have to have the rapture first. But if they're both imminent and nobody knows the time of or the arrival time of either of them, then they have to both occur at the same time logically. So we went through that. But I think to somehow make Jesus' teaching just kind of a continuation on through the tribulation period, talking about the days of Noah, I think that runs into contextual problems. My second reason, the word taken is paralambano, and it means to take to or with oneself. Again, Vine's dictionary says this word change is interesting considering the shift in verse 36. So Vines gives us the definition to take to or with oneself, and I think that the change is very interesting when you combine it with the shift, in verse 36. The word means there's an accompaniment, usually, not always, in a positive sense, in other words, for a close relationship. So if it's talking about taking with, it mostly means taking with in a positive sense, but it can mean, obviously, in a negative sense also. The word is used 49 times in the New Testament. The word is used 16 times out of those 49 in Matthew's Gospel. Most are positive. One is definitely negative, where Jesus was taken, paralambano, and beaten by the guards in 27:27. In other words, he was accompanied by the guards. So they took him with them, and then he beat them. So obviously the results of the taking was not positive in that example, but the context determined that. There may be one or two possible others, but this one is obviously definitely negative. 3 days after this discourse that Jesus is teaching the disciples on the Mount of Olives, Jesus uses the same word in John 14:3 to explain that he will come and receive them to himself in the rapture, right? My series on the rapture on this channel explains the detail of Jesus teaching the rapture to the apostles in John 14. In other words, I'm not going to get into the rapture in John 14 and the detail of that. In the rapture series, I go through that. I correlate John 14 to 1 Thessalonians 4. So there's a very, very tight correlation to what Jesus teaches and what Paul says that he got from Jesus. But the point is that the disciples hear this, and then 3 days later in the upper room, they hear Jesus use the same word to say, I'm going to come and take you to me. All right? I'm going to come back for you. Third, what is very telling is the word used for left, right? And it means, again, Vines tells us to leave, leave alone, forsake, neglect. So the word typically does not have a positive connotation to it, okay? And so we're dealing with the initial word for take in verse 39 is different than the words for take, paralambano, in verses 40 and 41. We have the shift occurring, and now we have where it says, one will be taken and one left. This word left means to leave, leave alone, forsake, or neglect. It takes on the meaning, really, of abandon, right? In its repeated use with personal objects in Matthew's Gospel, though it has a wide breadth of uses. So though it does have a very wide breadth of uses, in Matthew's Gospel, the way he uses it when it's related to personal objects, effectively it means to abandon, okay? Matthew uses the word over 50 times of the 146 times it is used in the New Testament, right? So Matthew uses it basically just over 1/3 the number of times. Example usage. Jesus used the exact same form of the word in Matthew 23:38 when he said, your house, and we actually started with these verses at the end of Matthew chapter 23 in this series. Your house is left to you desolate, because God was leaving it without his presence, and he was leaving it alone, neglected, forsaken, abandoned, right? That's the only thing that really makes a proper comparison there. It does not appear to be a word of God's care of believers left to enter the kingdom. He didn't abandon them to enter the kingdom. So I think that as we start to kind of accumulate the different points here and connect some of the dots grammatically as well as contextually, I think that it really does give us a stronger case for the rapture in these two verses. Now, words must be interpreted within their context, but I believe that we have the context here to support the natural use of this word and the other words we are discussing. So I don't think that we're violating any major contextual or grammatical rules in doing this. I actually think we have the strength and support of them. We don't have to explain anything away, is my point, okay? Fourth, the warning of the days of Noah seems unnecessary if it is in the tribulation period. Doesn't really seem to make much sense, does it, if you place that warning during the catastrophe, really, of what's going to be occurring on earth. It doesn't seem to make sense that Jesus would compare life before the flood, the days of Noah, and how people ignored the warnings of Noah of the coming of the flood judgment on the world with the second coming at the end of the 7-year tribulation period that will be a time of unprecedented judgments, wrath, wars, pestilence, earthquakes, famines, and martyrdom, beginning with the beginning mark of the signing of the 7-year covenant. We've referenced that, Daniel 9:27, and the abomination of desolation that Jesus talked about in Matthew 24:15. In other words, the one is a warning of judgment to come. The other is a time of judgment that has already come upon the world, of which the unbelievers find themselves trapped in. So it just doesn't seem to make sense. Why would you warn of the days of Noah that comes across as, normal life and everything is just kind of going on, and then all of a sudden this judgment comes when you're in the middle of the judgment? It just doesn't seem to fit like a normal context of what Jesus is actually explaining. Placing the days of Noah in the tribulation period to anticipate the second coming does not seem to fit the context or correlation Jesus is making. However, life before the tribulation period fits parallel with life before the flood more naturally. So next, remember, the second coming has signs, but the start of the tribulation period, the day of the Lord, has no signs. It is imminent. The flood judgment hit and no one could escape. It was done. I mean, the door was shut on the ark. Nobody else was getting in. The rain and the water blanket fell, and that was it. People were trapped in that time. The day of the Lord will come and no one will escape. We saw that in 1 Thessalonians 5. And, now Jesus talks in Luke, if we were to just back up here, Luke 21:36, it talks about how, Jesus says, be ready so you be able to escape that time. Well, if you can escape that time, that means if you don't escape that time, you're trapped in it. I mean, it's the only logical conclusion you can come to. The flood judgment was warned against, but had no evidence of its arrival. In other words, it had never rained. Peter, we just read in 2 Peter, right? He says that, let's see. Let me get this up here. So if we back up, right, we learn that in verse 5, it says that God did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly. So Noah was preaching righteousness. He was sharing the truth. He was providing them the information that this flood was coming. They didn't believe him because there had not been a flood. Now, unbelievers, they think we're crazy. They say, hey, there's a time coming on the world, blah, blah, blah. God's going to take his people prior to that. You'll be trapped there. Come to Christ now. And they think, what do you want, another planet? So they have the same view. So they go on in their normal course of life. Once that time hits, they're trapped. Okay? But it's possible to escape it. That's the point. There is an escape opportunity there. The day of the Lord will come, and no one has evidence of its arrival, right? There's no listed sign. So we're fighting, in a sense, the same challenge that Noah did, which is basically trying to warn people that there's a time of judgment coming, and things are going to be so awful that they'll be lucky to survive that time. So we fight the same challenge that Noah did, because we can't provide them evidence. Now we can talk about, hey, look at what God's doing with Israel, and this is kind of part of prophecy, and we can get into some of the things that are happening globally in regards to some connections with prophecy. But the problem is, like Peter said that people are going to say in 2 Peter 3, they're going to say, everything's been like that since the beginning of time, right? So they're going to be mockers walking after their own lusts, saying, where's the promise of his coming? Look, everything's always been the same. We've been hearing this stuff for years. Jesus is coming, Jesus is doing this, but he's not. You guys are just believing all this fantasy. So we fight that same challenge. We can't change, look, I didn't make up the truth, so I can't change it. It's still the same truth. However, we just need to pray that God will open people's hearts as we share the gospel with them. So the goal is to bring them to Christ. Look, the house is burning. It's coming down. Our goal is to get as many people out of the house as we can. We cannot put this fire out. This ball is rolling to the end. The globalism is going to occur. The Antichrist will be ruling. This is all going to happen. That's why it's all written. God is outside of time. He sees the end from the beginning. He provided the information to John. We have it in the book of Revelation. We have it in the prophets in the Old Testament. We have the words of Jesus. It describes all this, but the problem is convincing people that it's true. So what do? You do your best to share the gospel, bring people to Christ, and then they will. That is their escape hatch. Okay, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that we're not going to prevent the program that is already in place to eventually come to the tribulation period. We may be able to delay it. We may be able to get more people saved during it in some fashion or another. However, the bottom line goal is to get people to come to Christ, to help them to grow, so that then they can go out and evangelize others, and the church can be developed internally, which is what we're doing here, trying to get a good grasp on Scripture, get some good disciplines down for studying it so that we can continue to disciple others, right? So Jesus said in Matthew 28, go into all the nations, and what? He wanted us to make disciples. Subject for another time, but a disciple does not equal a believer. You can be a believer and not be a disciple, but you can't be a disciple and not be a believer. A disciple is somebody that willingly has yielded to the work that God wants to do in their life. We call that sanctification, because Christians can fight God too, okay? Not a good thing to do, not recommended, obviously, but we have a will that is set inside with a sinful nature. Though we've been given a divine nature, through the Holy Spirit, we still have our sinful nature until we get our glorified bodies in the rapture. So the problem is that we can still have a tendency to challenge God on many things that he wants to do in our lives, but the goal is to make disciples. A disciple is somebody that denies himself, picks up his cross, and follows Jesus daily. That's not how you get saved. That is how you grow. When you get saved, you're asked to believe. You're not asked to come to this place of like ultimate denial and I'll do this and I'll do that. No. You can't do that to get saved. You do that after you're saved. To get saved, God requires that we believe into a relationship with Christ, who he is, what he's done for us. Okay? Fifth, the second coming will be 7 years from the signing of the Antichrist treaty with Israel, right? Daniel 9:27, like we just mentioned. And then 1,260 days from the abomination of desolation, with all the accompanying signs Jesus gives that will occur during the tribulation period. How can the second coming be the event spoken of as one that no one knows the day or the hour? How can no one know that? It's just not possible. It's not possible to give somebody a calendar and say, but nobody can know when the event's going to happen on the calendar that I just marked for you. How can you do that? It's just not possible. So the phrase describes an imminent event such as the rapture and start of the 7-year tribulation, not an anticipated and calculated event. That's the bottom line. The phrase cannot be made to only apply to disciples living at the time Jesus shared this with them. I've heard people I greatly respect say, well, maybe at the time that Jesus shared it, no one could know that. Well, that's kind of stretching it. And I think that's toying with the text. I think that's unfair to do that. Because the phrase, no one knows the day or the hour, is comprehensive of all people and not limited to a time frame. Both Jesus in his humanity and the angels did not know the day or the hour, revealing the timing of this comprehensive should be just unknown event. So how can it be that comprehensive that no one knows, the angels don't know, Jesus in his humanity doesn't know, but then all of a sudden, like it's just like during that time, but now we know? I don't think so. I don't think that really works at all. Sixth, the thief in the night imagery correlates Matthew 24:40-44 and Paul's words in 1 Thessalonians 5, which means the pre-trib rapture is in view. So I think actually we'll stop here on number 6 because it may require a little bit of explanation, and it can certainly, I know this stuff can, give you a headache trying to think through some of it. We've gone through 5 of the reasons. You can certainly go back and review those. Look, if you disagree with me, that's fine. I'm just trying to give you my approach, my understanding of not only why, but how I'm approaching the scripture to come to these conclusions. So hopefully you're blessed by it. Even if you disagree, at least you're challenged to your own viewpoint and why you hold it. One of the things that I find interesting is that oftentimes when people hold a variant view, regardless of what it is, doesn't have to be this subject, can be other subjects. I've talked to atheists and evolutionists and all, and when they tell me their view and I start asking them questions, I would say probably 99 out of 100 times, if you ask a few questions for them to actually define why they believe something, they back up maybe a couple of questions and then they're not sure. Okay, well, I was told it in school, I read it in a book or whatever, but they don't really understand why they believe it. I asked somebody that was an evolutionist one time. I said, he said, "Oh, I believe in evolution," and I said, "Well, what is evolution?" He said, "Well, I mean, it's everything changed. I mean, we changed from whatever we were in primitive, amoeba form, and now we're people." And I said, "Well, how did that happen?" "Well, I don't know. I mean, it just happened." "Well, I understand that, but what was the mechanism?" So they say, "Well, I mean, and then I actually helped this person. I said, "You mean natural selection?" "Yes, I mean natural selection." I said, "Well, how does that work?" So once you actually start nicely, but asking people how they actually understand their own position, you very quickly realize that many have not really thought it through. So it's easy to say evolution is natural selection, but at the same time, what does that actually mean? So that actually means that without any intelligent intervention, right? No God, no other outside intelligence or anything else, matter somehow acting on matter, and we're not even going to talk about where the matter came from, okay? But assuming it's all here and interacting, if you give it enough time, you're going to develop these very highly complex systems that we still don't understand all about. it's only my opinion, but I can't imagine why anybody that knows anything legitimately about scientific investigation, especially in the area of biology, and doctors, how they understand how people's bodies work, or veterinarians with animals, how they can look at the complexity of what is there and say, well, it just kind of all happened by chance. That is chance upon chance upon chance upon chance upon chance upon chance, to a billion chances, all heading in the right direction, developing without any realistic failure mechanisms along the way. These are completed systems without any added intelligence to put them there. There's not 1 nanosecond of anticipation in developing any kind of system. The simple one that I love is, not to get off, but the echolocation used by dolphins. I mean, you think about this, right? So they need this to survive. This is how they function, this is how they communicate, this is how they find food. How did that happen? So if at some point they could develop within their head the ability to make a sound, okay, so they make a sound. They may not even have ears, right? They may not even be able to hear it. But you see where I'm going here? Because once they can make the sound has to be projected out, because it has to be also at a pitch that can penetrate the water properly. Now, it hits something. Well, the sound reverberates back if it hits a fish or whatever. And not only does it come back, but the dolphin actually has to have something that can capture that sound. So then the dolphin captures the sound. Then they have to interpret the sound. What does the sound mean to them? The sound, how do they identify a fish that is food, in contrast to anything else? It's a very, very sophisticated system that cannot work in parts. You can't put it together piecemeal. If it took millions of years for a dolphin to develop it, they'd be all dead, okay? The point of this is that people have this very, very ignorant idea that somehow this stuff just magically happened. I call it the miracle of evolution, right, with natural selection. But the reality is that it just does not happen like that. We don't see anything in any scientific investigation come close to even hinting that that can occur. I'm not saying that we watch it occur. I'm saying there's nothing that we understand, that there's no non-intelligent mechanism that just kind of happens randomly that would develop anything with that kind of sophistication. And that's not even close to other sophisticated, obviously designed systems. These things have to be put together all at the same time. How did your circulatory system get set up? Well, obviously you needed veins for the blood. Why did your body develop veins? You need a heart to pump it. In other words, this is a system that is a complete system. This can't come from an amoeba. That's absurd. That is so unscientific and ignorant, I can't believe it. But people actually believe this stuff because they're taught it in school. Look, if you go through 12 years of school, public school, and they tell you that you evolved, you don't know any different. You believe what you're told. That's called indoctrination. But if you're a scientist or you're somebody that knows better and you still believe this nonsense, okay, then you're fighting your own conscience on it. There's a difference. If I'm just told something, then yeah, I'm indoctrinated. But if I know better and I know that there's other alternatives and I know how things work and certain things can't work the way that, they're pretended to, then I'm being deceptive. And I think that's the problem, why we're in this place where we're fighting this foolish evolutionary concept that's just bleeded through society because people just don't know any better. They are basically ignorant. And it's unfortunate because, Nobody actually uses evolution in any kind of scientific work because it doesn't work, okay? They may believe evolution, but they can never use any evolutionary concept because it's nonsense. It never happened. So anyways, side issue, but again, we have to approach things logically, things like that, as well as the scriptures themselves, because obviously God makes sense. He's the ultimate reality, and everything is correlated back to him that's true, and everything else is, quite frankly, myth and nonsense. But we need to approach the scripture realizing that God has created us in a way where we can use our normal thinking process, the rational ability that he has put in us, made in his image, right? He is the ultimate rational being, but he has made us rational also so that we can logically work through these things. So God is not going to logically contradict himself is the point, right? So anyways, dig in, and may God richly bless you until next time as you continue to study his word.